Oops, I accidentally backed into your car, my sister said with a smile, after I refused to co-sign her loan. My mom shrugged, it's just a dent. I stayed quiet. That night, I checked one document and made one phone call. But at 9 a.m., she discovered something that left her speechless. I, 32M, watched my sister walk away from my dented car like she'd just stepped on a crack in the sidewalk. The scratch ran from the rear quarter panel all the way to the driver's door, deep enough that I could see primer. My sister stood there with her phone in one hand, car keys dangling from the other, wearing that same smile she'd worn since we were kids, the one that said consequences were for other people. She told me it was an accident, said she'd been distracted. Her tone suggested I should be grateful she'd bothered to mention it at all. I'd told her no exactly 4 hours earlier when she'd asked me to co-sign a loan for some business venture she refused to explain. The timing felt deliberate because it was. Mom emerged from the house wiping her hands on a dish towel. She glanced at the damage and said it was just a dent, nothing worth making a fuss over. She asked if I really wanted to ruin family harmony over something so small. I stood there calculating the repair cost in my head, probably $3,000, maybe more, and said nothing. My sister got in her car and drove off. Mom went back inside. I took photos from every angle, made sure the timestamps were visible, and drove to work with a grinding sensation in my chest that had nothing to do with the transmission. The thing about my sister was that she'd been doing this her entire life. Small destructions, borrowed money that evaporated, promises that dissolved the moment you tried to hold her to them. She'd crashed Mom's car in high school, and somehow I'd ended up losing my driving privileges for a month. She'd stolen my college fund to invest in a friend's startup that never started up, and Mom had suggested I take out loans instead of making waves. I'd always been the reasonable one, the one who absorbed the damage and moved on because family was supposed to be more important than money or fairness or basic respect. But something had shifted when I'd looked at that loan application she'd shoved across the coffee table. The amount was staggering. The business plan was 3 paragraphs of buzzwords, and my signature would have tied me to her financial decisions for the next decade. I'd said no as politely as I could manage, explained that I was saving for a house, that my credit couldn't take the risk, that maybe she should try a traditional bank or save up herself. She'd call me selfish, said I'd always been the favorite even though that was demonstrably untrue, told me I'd regret choosing money over family. For hours later, my car looked like it had been keyed by someone with a steering wheel. At my desk, I couldn't focus. My coworker asked if I was okay, and I said I was fine. The lie sat heavy in my mouth. I opened my laptop and started searching for something I should have checked years ago. My sister had listed me as a reference on job applications before. She'd put my number down on rental agreements without asking. Last year, she'd mentioned needing my information for some insurance thing, and I'd handed it over because that's what I always did. Trust without verification. Benefit of the doubt extended into infinity. I logged into my credit monitoring service. The page loaded slowly, ads flickering in the margins. And there it was, an authorized user account on a credit card I'd never opened. $17,000 in debt. 60 days past due. My credit score had dropped 90 points in 6 months, and I'd never noticed because I'd been busy working 60-hour weeks and trusting that my family wouldn't sabotage me. My hands shook as I clicked through the details. The card had been opened 2 years ago. Small charges at first, always paid on time. Then larger purchases, cash advances, balance transfers. The payment history showed a pattern of minimum payments until 6 months ago when they'd stopped entirely. I called the credit card company. The representative asked me to verify my identity, and I went through the automated security questions in a daze. When I finally got a human on the line, I explained that I'd never authorized this account. She asked if someone might have had access to my personal information, and I said yes, probably my sister. The representative put me on hold. Music played. I stared at my cubicle wall where I'd pinned a photo from last Christmas. Me, Mom, and my sister around the tree. Everyone smiling like we were a normal family that didn't use each other as financial crash test dummies. The representative came back and explained the process for disputing fraudulent accounts. I'd need to file a police report, provide documentation, fill out affidavits. The words identity theft kept appearing in her explanation, and each time felt like a small detonation in my chest. I asked what would happen to the person who'd opened the account. She said that depended on whether I wanted to press charges. Her tone suggested she'd had this conversation before, probably hundreds of times, and knew exactly how complicated it got when family was involved. I told her I'd call back and hung up. The rest of the workday blurred past. I went through the motions of answering emails and attending meetings while my brain ran calculations. $17,000 in debt. $3,000 for the car. Years of smaller incidents I'd written off as accidents or misunderstandings. The college fund that had never been investigated. The time she'd borrowed my laptop, and it came back wiped clean with all my freelance work deleted. I drove home past my sister's apartment complex. Her car sat in its usual spot, the front bumper perfectly aligned with my paint transfer. No damage on her end. Of course not. At home, I pulled up every financial document I had. Bank statements going back 5 years. Credit reports from all 3 bureaus. Tax returns. I cross-referenced dates and amounts. Built a timeline of every time money had gone missing or credit inquiries had appeared without explanation. The pattern was undeniable. She'd been using my information like a personal ATM for years. Small enough amounts that I'd never noticed, diversified enough that no single incident seemed worth confronting. But together, they added up to something that looked like a long-term strategy. I called a lawyer my coworker had recommended once. Left a voicemail explaining I needed advice about identity theft and family law. Then I filed a police report online, uploaded photos of my damaged car, and attached screenshots of the fraudulent credit account. The report asked if I wanted to press charges. I checked yes and felt something shift in my chest. Not quite relief. Not quite vindication. Just a sense that I'd finally stopped bleeding. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in bed running through scenarios. Mom would take her side. That was guaranteed. She'd say I was tearing the family apart over money, that blood was thicker than credit scores, that I'd always been too rigid and unforgiving. My sister would claim it was a misunderstanding, that she'd planned to pay everything back, that I'd given her permission and just didn't remember. None of it would matter. The documentation didn't lie. The timestamps and signatures and IP addresses told a story that no amount of emotional manipulation could revise. At 9 the next morning, my phone rang. My sister. I let it go to voicemail. She called again immediately. Then Mom called. Then my sister again. I silenced my phone and went for a run. When I got back, there were 14 missed calls and a string of texts that devolved from confusion to anger to panic. My sister demanded to know what I'd done. Mom said the police had called her asking questions. My sister said I'd ruined her life over a misunderstanding. I texted back one sentence. Check your credit report. The response came in seconds. She called me every name I'd ever heard and several I hadn't. Said I'd backstabbed her, that she'd trusted me, that I was destroying the family. The irony was apparently invisible to her. Mom called and I answered. She asked what I was thinking, how I could do this to my own sister. I asked her if she knew about the credit card fraud. Silence. Then she said my sister had mentioned needing to use my information temporarily, just to get back on her feet, and she'd assumed I'd agreed to help. I told her I'd never agreed to anything. That temporary had turned into 2 years and $17,000. That my car was damaged in retaliation for setting a boundary. That I was done absorbing collateral damage from someone who'd never faced consequences. Mom said I was being cruel. That family helped each other. That I had a good job and could afford to be generous. I told her fraud wasn't generosity and hung up. The lawyer called back that afternoon. We talked for 45 minutes. He explained my options, the likelihood of criminal charges sticking, the process for removing fraudulent accounts from my credit report. He asked if I was sure I wanted to go through with it, and I said yes without hesitation. Update 1. The police detective assigned to my case called 3 days later. She'd reviewed the documentation and wanted to interview me in person. I took a morning off work and sat in a bland conference room answering questions about my relationship with my sister, the timeline of fraudulent activity, and whether I'd ever given verbal or written permission for her to use my identity. The detective was professional, but not unkind. She mentioned that family fraud cases were complicated because proving intent was difficult. I showed her the text messages from the day my car was damaged, explained the timeline of her loan request, and the immediate retaliation. She made notes and said she'd be in touch. My sister was arrested a week later. Mom called me screaming before the police had even finished processing the paperwork. She said I destroyed our family, that I was vindictive and heartless, that my sister had made mistakes but didn't deserve to be treated like a criminal. I asked Mom if she'd known about the other times. The college fund, the laptop, The job references I'd never agreed to give. The apartment deposits paid with checks that bounced from my account. Mom went quiet. Then she said those were different, that I'd never complained before, that forgiveness was supposed to be unlimited. I told her enabling wasn't the same as forgiveness and hung up. My sister made bail. She immediately started a social media campaign about being betrayed by family, about how blood meant nothing anymore, about cancel culture destroying people over honest mistakes. She never mentioned the specific nature of her arrest. Her friends flooded the comments with support. Several people messaged me calling me heartless without knowing any details. I deactivated my social media and focused on cleaning up the financial wreckage. The credit card company removed the fraudulent account from my report after I provided the police report and signed affidavits. My score began climbing back up. I got estimates for repairing my car and filed an insurance claim, listing my sister as the at-fault driver. Her insurance company contacted me. Apparently, she'd reported the incident as a parking lot accident with an unknown vehicle. When they learned she'd admitted fault to me directly and that I had photos with timestamps, they opened a fraud investigation on her policy. The repair cost came in at $3,200. Her insurance initially balked at paying since she'd filed a false report, but my lawyer sent a letter and they settled quickly. Update 2. The court date arrived on a Tuesday morning in April. I wore a suit I'd bought for job interviews and felt like I was attending a funeral for a relationship that had been dead for years, but nobody had bothered to bury. My sister sat with a public defender who looked exhausted. Mom sat behind her in the gallery, shooting daggers at me with her eyes. I sat on the other side with my lawyer, feeling like the courtroom geography represented something larger than just legal proceedings. The prosecutor presented the evidence efficiently. Bank records, credit reports, signed affidavits from the credit card company, my testimony about never authorizing the accounts. My sister's defense was that we'd had a verbal agreement, that she'd assumed I'd approved everything, that it was a family misunderstanding blown out of proportion. The judge asked her why she'd continued making charges after the card went delinquent, why she'd never made payments from her own accounts, why she'd reported the car accident falsely to her insurance company if everything was above board. My sister cried, said she'd been struggling financially and made bad decisions, that she'd planned to fix everything before I found out, that family was supposed to forgive each other. The judge said family was also supposed to respect each other's autonomy and financial security. He found her guilty of identity theft and insurance fraud, sentenced her to 18 months probation, 200 hours community service, and ordered her to pay full restitution for the fraudulent charges plus the car damage. Mom left the courtroom without looking at me. My sister was processed through some additional paperwork and released. I walked out into spring sunshine feeling lighter than I had in months. My lawyer shook my hand and said I'd done the right thing. That family didn't give anyone permission to commit crimes. That boundaries weren't betrayal. I drove to my apartment and started packing. I'd accepted a job offer in another state. Better pay, better opportunities, and 800 miles between me and people who thought love meant absorbing abuse without complaint. Update 3. 6 months later, I was settled into my new place. A one-bedroom apartment with actual closet space and a parking spot where nobody retaliated against my car for having boundaries. Work was good. I'd made friends who didn't have complicated histories with me. Life felt clean in a way it never had before. Mom called occasionally. Brief conversations where she asked how I was doing, and I gave neutral answers. She never apologized, but she stopped defending my sister, which felt like progress even if it wasn't reconciliation. My sister sent an email. No subject line. The body was 3 paragraphs about how hard probation was, how community service was humiliating, how she'd lost friends who'd learned the truth about her arrest. She said she understood why I'd done what I did, but wished I'd handled it privately. That involving the police had been excessive. I read it twice and deleted it. There was nothing to respond to. She still didn't understand that fraud wasn't a family matter to be handled over coffee and apologies. That she'd made choices with real consequences, and I'd simply stopped shielding her from them. The credit card debt was being garnished from her paychecks at a rate that would take 3 years to clear. The car damage had been paid through a combination of her insurance settlement and a payment plan I'd agreed to through my lawyer. She'd sent 2 payments on time and missed the third, but that was between her and the court now. I started dating someone I'd met through work. Told her on the 3rd date that I didn't talk to most of my family and why. She nodded and said her brother had stolen from her parents for years, and everyone had pretended it wasn't happening until her dad's retirement account was empty. We understood each other in a way that felt like finding someone who spoke the same rare dialect. Sometimes I wondered if I'd been too harsh. If there'd been another way to handle it that wouldn't have ended with criminal charges and family fractures. Then I'd check my credit score, back up to where it should be, and remember the years of small violations that had led to that moment. The thing about boundaries was that they required enforcement. Saying no meant nothing if you didn't back it up when people pushed. My sister had pushed my entire life, and I'd always yielded because that's what family did. Until the day I realized that family wasn't supposed to feel like controlled demolition from the inside. I never regretted the phone call I'd made that night. The police report that set everything in motion. The decision to let consequences land where they belonged instead of cushioning someone else's fall with my own security. My sister would probably never forgive me. Mom would probably always think I'd been too harsh. But I slept well in my new apartment, parked my repaired car without anxiety, and checked my credit report with confidence that the only charges on it were ones I'd actually made. That was worth more than their approval had ever been.